Get him up! Two large men towered over the unfortunate man curled up on the ground. Mo and Tuck, the two henchmen Manny trusted most, as much as you can trust henchmen, grabbed each by the arm and roughly lifted the guy to a standing position. The man was unable to stand upright on his own, so he had to be held down. "Please, Manny," the guy said weakly. "It wasn't my fault at all. I would never rob you. You know me." Manny headed toward him. He walked with a steady stride, using the baseball bat in his hand as a walking stick. It rang across the concrete floor, echoing off the walls of the empty warehouse. As he approached the guy, he leaned over and stared intently into his eyes. Then, his trademark smirk appeared on his lips. In an almost friendly gesture, he patted the man on the cheek. "Donnie, Donnie, Donnie!" he said, as if he was overwhelmed with regret. "Here we are. Four guys who'd rather be anywhere right now. I know I had other plans. Lisa bought that little red license plate. You know. And get this. She took a friend with her." "Shit. What?" exclaimed Mo. The picture almost made him drop the poor guy. "I know, right?" said Manny, happily patting Mo on the shoulder. Then, addressing his target as if this was just a friendly conversation, he continued. "I mean, I had no idea she was bi. But between you and me, I think she just gets off on knowing she's about to get dumped. You know what I mean?" "Manny, please." "Anyway," said Manny, ignoring the man, "you can imagine why I'm not happy to see you now. My guys here probably had other things to do." Nodding his head to the second henchman, he asked, "What about you, Mo? Do you have any plans for today?" "Right." "What?" Trying to hide his irritation, Took said, "My name is Took. It's that Mo over there." Never mind. Damn henchman. He had just killed a setup. What did it matter what their names were? For the money he paid them, he should have named them Godzilla and King Kong. Turning again to the man in the center, aka Donnie, he said, "You've been working with me for, what, 3 years? I got you when my man Rick ended up behind bars. I thought you had what it took to run shit. That's what you told me. What exactly did you say?" "Manny." "That's right. You said I'd never regret giving you a chance. But ever since you got behind the wheel, I've regretted nothing. So far, 4 of my couriers have been robbed. Whoever did it somehow knew the exact time and the exact route. You said you would deal with it, and I let you do it. But now..." Manny stretched out his arms and turned around, as if visualizing the space around him. In doing so, he let the bat dangle between his fingers. "Look, I know I screwed up. I know you did, Manny. But I can fix it. Give me a couple weeks, and I promise you that. You know, I've known Rick for a while now," Manny said, interrupting him again, as if he was about to say something not important enough to listen to. "He's been like a brother to me. Ever since his dad died, we were really close. He was the only person I could trust. Rick knew how to get things done. When he was my right-hand man, I never had any problems like that. I never, not once, went into an empty warehouse. If someone was stupid enough to make an attempt on me, well, let's just say Rick made sure to teach them a good lesson. And believe me, when he was done, his class was made up of only honors students." 3 of the 4 men in the room laughed at this, as if they were a group of guys just talking non-stop. The only one not laughing was the one who was seconds away from losing control of his bodily functions. Manny said softly, "But for some reason you just can't follow through, Donnie. My name is losing respect. People are starting to think I'm weak, that they can take what's mine. I can't let that happen." "Manny, Manny, please!" exclaimed Donnie with a desperate plea. Manny took a few steps backward. Abruptly switching gears, he asked carelessly, "Do you like that shirt?" "What?" Swiping the bat off his neck, he stretched out his arms and struck a pose. "My shirt, the one I'm wearing. You like it?" Embarrassed, Donnie said, Yeah, I guess." Manny nodded in agreement, then said, "Me too. It cost almost $500 for a shirt." When I was growing up, I never thought I'd be able to spend that much on one article of clothing. He grinned to himself and stepped back against the wall. The three other men watched him strangely, perplexed as to what the hell was going on. As if to confirm Donnie's fears, he grinned and said, "After we paid so much money, it would be a shame to get blood all over everything. You know what I mean?" "So, Donnie, here's the dilemma I have regarding you. Maybe you can help me with it." Finally, he turned to the trembling man. "Either you're the most incompetent lieutenant I've ever had, or you're the smartest spy I've ever had." "What? Come on, man. You know I'm not a spy." Grinning, Manny shrugged and said, "Then it's just incompetence. Okay. Tell me who you're working with to steal my shit. We don't have to do the training. But if you keep hiding things from me..." "I'm not working with anyone." Manny lowered his head and shook it. Sighing, he said, "Okay. I guess we'll work on my swing then." "Manny, please. Please. I'm your cousin." Next chapter. Manny threw the bat into the trunk of the car. Manny rolled his eyes and asked, "What?" "You said you were just going to scare him." Manny hummed, pulling his gloves off his hands and throwing them in there as well. "That's what I did. To death. But..." Mo looked confused before he said slowly, "He was your cousin." "So?" The horror on Mo's face made Manny scoff. "See? That's some weak shit right there. That's why you'll never be in charge. You're too soft. Nobody's going to be afraid of you. You have to be like Stephen Curry to be respected for running shit." Tucker, the other henchman, saw an opportunity to suck it up and finally stop being a faceless chicken shit. "That's right, boss. You should be a superstar," he purred. Manny shook his head and muttered, "No, dumbass. You just have to be ready to shoot wherever you are." Manny reached into the trunk and pulled the car keys out of his dead cousin's pocket. Tossing them to Mo, he said, "You know what to do. Make an order to the butcher and then pick up the car. Let me know when it's ready." Whatever Donnie had done, he didn't deserve all of this. "Yo, Tuck!" called out Manny, snapping his fingers in front of his face. "You need me to give you a minute with him?" "No," said Mo, slamming the trunk shut. Walking over to the driver's seat, he shouted, "And my name is Mo." "Nobody cares. Do it." As the car's taillights disappeared around the corner, Manny pointed at the real Tuck. Your nose is tickling my ass. Can you pull it back for a while to clean all this shit up? And use more bleach. I don't want to end up on the ID channel." Tuck nodded and went to follow orders as well. Manny, left to himself, sighed tiredly and leaned against the wall. His lips pressed into a thin line, and a look of remorse appeared on his face. "Damn it, Donnie. Why didn't you just tell me who the hell you were working with?" he thought, as his hands began to shake. All these emotions raging inside him were dangerous. Attachment makes people weak. Plenty of kings have found themselves facing the muzzle of a gun when making an emotional decision. With so many wanting to take his place, Manny couldn't afford to show weakness. Who cared if Donnie was his cousin? Donnie was too much of a burden. Whether he suffered from stunning incompetence or questionable loyalty, he had to go. And the fact that he was family made it even more urgent. People can't stab you in the back from afar. They have to be there for you. Right now, he had bigger problems. His real problem was a series of questions he had no answers to. How could $750,000 worth of drugs just disappear? Who had the ability to lift all that merchandise? Who would have the guts to steal from him? Who does he have to take down to make sure it doesn't happen again? And most importantly, how is he going to pay off the Colombians? At the thought of the Colombians waiting for their money, an icy shiver ran down his spine. The Sanchez family had a notorious reputation. They were ruthless businessmen. Ruthlessness was literally a business strategy for them. They weren't just at the top of the food chain. They hovered above it like satellites. They didn't deal with two things: late payments and weakness. The reason they had chosen Manny as their distributor was because he was as ruthless as they were. But at this point, Manny risked showing them both of his flaws. If he couldn't find his product or make those who robbed him suffer, the Colombians would lose faith in him. And if they lost faith, they wouldn't need him. When they fired a guy, they didn't send a pink slip or a final check to the house. One option was to literally set him on fire. Manny needed answers, and fast. An afternoon spent in the batting cage with his cousin was unproductive. What to do next? If only he had a good right-handed reliever to take over. But there was no one suitable. No one but Rick. His thoughts went back to the day he'd visited his longtime friend. Contrary to what he'd said, he hadn't gone there just to visit Rick. And no, he hadn't gone there for Tracy. No matter how beautiful she was, there was always someone even more beautiful. He'd cast her aside as soon as she'd ended things with him. Manny had actually gone there to see how Rick felt about returning to the family. Things hadn't been the same since Donnie had taken his place. The problem was that no one reacted to Donnie the way Rick did. There was something special about him that they reacted to. It was respect. They feared him, but they also respected him. Manny lost that when Rick left. Without respect, fear is empty and temporary. Screw Rick. To hell with his overly sensitive ass. How could he let some bitch come between them? After all they'd been through, he just severed a friendship over some woman. Yeah, Tracy was good, but he could find Rick a bitch 10 times better with one phone call. Hell, Rick could have his girl if he wanted. After all, she was bi now, apparently. Why couldn't Rick realize that Manny had actually done him a favor? Didn't he realize that women who looked like Tracy could pick on men? Especially women with her considerable talents. It would be nothing for her to pull some rich, college-educated man with a 401k and a stock portfolio. This guy would try to steal her, make her his. He would never let her go. He would buy her anything her heart desired to make her fall in love with him. How would Rick be able to compete with him when he got out? He was an ex-con with no job, no education, and no way to provide her with the lifestyle she was used to before he went to prison. The guy who would steal her away would be able to give her everything Rick was giving her, but he'd do it legally. And with Tracy's mom playing cheerleader, Rick wouldn't even have a wife to come home to. Hypergamy. It's a real thing. But Manny wasn't one of those things. When it came time to back out, he didn't get upset. He didn't try to steal his wife away or force her to choose between them. He understood the situation for what it was. He was just a confidant to fill the loneliness, a surrogate body to warm her when she felt the itch. That was his role, and he stayed in it. In his opinion, it was better that he was the one on standby, not some other guy. You're welcome, Rick. But of course, Rick didn't notice any of that. He didn't like it when Manny stepped in for the team. It was a dirty job, but Manny did it without complaint. Sometimes he was just a humanitarian. Besides, Rick didn't remember his book staying full with money from Manny's pocket. His child was fed from the same purse. Yet all Rick saw was pain, betrayal, and heartbreak. As befits a weak bitch, why does Rick keep pretending he's the same guy? He's not. He's a wolf. And right now, Manny needed that wolf on his side. How could he get through to Rick? The old Rick, not this sad, sullen pretender. An idea flashed through his mind. He glanced at his watch and nodded, noting the time. Maybe he should make a trip to Walmart. They often bragged about having everything a man needed under one roof. It was quite possible they might have the answer to his little problem as well. Manny picked up his shirt and put it on. As he buttoned the buttons, he groaned through clenched teeth. Damn! He shouted out once again. Despite all his caution, he had somehow stained his collar with blood. More than likely, it was Donnie's blood. So the shirt had gone from his favorite to evidence that could be used against him. He had no choice but to burn it. Why did things like this keep happening to him? He was just a businessman trying to get his piece of paradise. Next chapter. Tracy blew a large pink bubble out of her mouth, then sucked it back in and burst it several times. When the bubble stopped making a satisfying sound, she made gum with her tongue for another bubble. Next customer in line. She said it in a professional voice, carefully hiding the irritation she felt. Money transfers, Western Union, stupid questions, complaining about long lines. This was her day. This was her day. It was her life. One of the perks of working in customer service, however, was the view from the window. From where she sat, her eyes could see everything that was going on in the front of the store. She could see who was coming in the doors, who was coming out, who was trying to steal, which cashier was being lazy, which cashier was being lazy. Everything. So when she looked up, she gasped in surprise and horror when Manchester goddamn Childs walked into the store. You could practically hear the sharp gasp as all eyes, devoid of the Y chromosome, turned toward the entrance. The lust factor in the room intensified as Manny entered the hall with the confidence of a celebrity on the red carpet. His appearance couldn't have been more grandiose as he moved in slow motion to the music. He hadn't come for shopping. Tracy realized it as soon as his eyes, covered by Ray-Ban glasses, turned in her direction. Without pretending he had any other motivation for coming to Walmart, he walked straight to her table, leaving a plume of pheromone cologne behind him. "I'm next," he said to the guy standing with his girlfriend at the front of the line. The guy looked like he was ready to object, but Manny looked him straight in the eye and said, "Brother, don't let this cost you 1,000 hospital bills." Was saving face in front of his girlfriend worth the smoke that would follow? The man looked between Manny and his girlfriend as if trying to solve the very mystery. Little did he know that he had already lost. Because of his indecision, she was losing respect for him with every passing second. He finally resigned himself to defeat and lowered his eyes to the ground. The world is full of weaklings, thought Manny. He then looked at the girl curiously. When her eyes met his, he winked and nodded at her. She smiled back. When Tracy got free, he didn't even wait to be invited. He just walked up to her with a cheeky grin on his face. "Hi, Trace. Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" Tracy said it in her normal voice, as if it was no different than the 6 people he had just rudely spoken in front of. "Yes? In fact, you can help me in so many ways. Take a break so we can talk." Still ignoring him, she asked, "Do you need to send money, receive money, or get a money order?" He smirked again. He looked you in the eye as he spoke, as if every word out of his mouth was a challenge. It commanded respect and attention. Leaning his elbows on the counter, he said, "Oh, I definitely need to get money, but not from Western Union." Tracy sighed loudly, now no longer trying to hide her irritation. No longer pretending to be professional, she said, "Manny, I'm at work. You're holding up the line. What do you need?" He cast an indifferent glance over his shoulder at the angry men behind him, then returned his attention to Tracy. "You're not listening. I've already told you what I want. I want you to take a break so we can talk." Tracy leaned in close to him and, gritting her teeth, hissed in an angry whisper, "We're not talking anymore. We've had enough." Raising a hand to stop what was about to come out of her mouth, he said seriously, "Relax. That's not why I'm here. I actually need to talk to you." The humor returned to his voice as he added, "Well, in other words, other than you telling me how big my—" "Sylvia!" shouted Tracy, interrupting him. "I'm on a 15-minute break. Can you cover for me until I get back?" Sylvia's eyes darted between her and the suave guy who wasn't her husband. A slight condemnation read in them, but she still replied, "Sure, girl." Tracy angrily walked around the table, past Manny, and out of the store. She didn't even check to see if he was behind her. On the way out, Manny unlocked his cell phone and handed it to the girl in line. Completely ignoring the guy next to her, he said, "Put your number on there. I'll be back for it." With those words, he swept past her angry boyfriend as if the guy didn't matter. When he met Tracy on the street, he found that she wasn't so easy to ignore. She stormed over to him and screamed, "What the hell, Manny? What do you want me to do? Get a divorce!" Manny grinned, shaking his head. "I take it Rick is still pouting at us." No, us, Manny. There's you and there's me. We're two people who shouldn't have gotten involved." With a knowing smirk, he said, "You're not mad because you slept with me. You're mad that your husband found out about it." Tracy shoved him hard with both hands on his chest, but he barely moved. "Yes, I am angry. I'm angry about the whole damn thing. I'm pissed that my life is in the shit and you think this is some kind of joke. I thought you were supposed to be my friend." The cocky grin left Manny's face for the first time. It was replaced by a genuinely contrite expression and a nod that confirmed her words. Truth be told, he liked Tracy. He liked spending time with her. She made him laugh. Really laugh, which was rare for him. Having a girl like that was one of the many things Manny envied Rick for, though he would never admit it. He could always find a prettier girl, no doubt. But to find one he trusted the way Rick trusted Tracy, never. "My bad, Trace. You're right. I was being an ass. I'm sorry you're going through a rough time." There wasn't a hint of sarcasm in his voice, so maybe he was even being serious. But with Manny, you never know. Tracy crossed her arms over her chest and looked away. "If he finds out you're coming to my work, I'll have an even harder time. He hardly notices me as it is." Then, turning to him curiously, she asked, "Why are you here?" "I need your help with Rick. You need to make him forget about this." Narrowed, skeptical eyes looked at Manny. "Why are you suddenly so concerned about his emotional state? You haven't even tried to call and apologize since you two fought." "I was trying to give him space. You know how he is." Tracy hummed and nodded understandingly. If anyone knew how stubborn Rick was, it was her. Feeling like he'd caught her on the hook, Manny gave her an innocent Oscar-winning look and added, "I just miss my friend. That's all." "Yeah, but I miss him too." She said this with sad eyes that stared into the ground. Feeling encouraged by the direction the conversation was taking, Manny asked, "Isn't there anything you can do to, soften it up? I know for a fact that you have certain skills that would make it impossible for him to get mad at you." With those words, he went too far. Tracy looked at him with a shocked look and pushed him again. "You can't talk to me like that, or look at me the way you do." That's probably what raised his first suspicions. "The way I look at you? Like a child looks at candy." Manny couldn't help but lick his lips. He couldn't help himself. Her comparison to candy made him wonder what she tasted like. And what she tasted like was sweet. Pointing her finger at him, she said, "See? That look right there." Manny groaned, but held his hands up in a sign of surrender. Okay. You're right. I'll have to work on that." She crossed her arms again and looked at him incredulously. She didn't believe the whole "I miss my friend" nonsense. He was up to something. "Maybe you should give Rick and I some privacy. Hopefully, he and I can find a way to work through this. If that happens, after a while he'll be able to forgive you too." Manny frowned. This schedule seemed awfully long to him. He didn't have time to wait for Rick. He needed answers, now. "I understand you, Trace. Really, I do. But this isn't working for me. I need you to work on your man a little faster. I can't get him to forgive me, let alone you." He lowered his voice and said, "Sure you can." He tried to appear nonchalant, but there was an urgency in his eyes and in his voice that made Tracy uneasy. He wasn't suggesting, he was ordering. The only thing that brought Manny out of his playful, arrogant demeanor was money. And when Manny didn't get money, he became very, very dangerous. He didn't need his friend Rick. He needed Rick the killer. The chill that ran down her spine made her wince, and all the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She'd seen Manny bullying before, but it had always been directed at someone else. But now, to be on his side was so scary. There was no way she wanted to drag her husband into this. Not again. She'd already lost him once before because of his criminal lifestyle. Last time, she had just sat back and enjoyed the illicit fruits it brought. But now that she knew how much those expensive gifts really cost, she wanted nothing to do with it. She'd rather die penniless than lose Rick again. She had to get Manny out of here. Okay. She lied in a thin voice. If I can get him to finally talk to me, I'll see what he has in mind regarding you. Thanks, Trace. I appreciate it. She tried to pull away, but he grabbed her arm and pulled her against him. His grip was firm, almost to the point of pain. Looking carefully into her worried eyes, he said, I believe in you. I know you can do this if you really want to. Don't disappoint me. Then she wrenched her hand away and headed back to the store with a quick step. Gloomy thoughts began to creep into his head, but he pushed them away. He could feel the walls of time closing in around him. For the sake of all of them, Tracy had better be able to reason with her man. If she couldn't, Manny might have to get more creative. As much as he wanted to use these tactics on his girlfriend, he no longer had a choice. Just as he was about to head to his car, the girl he had given his phone to appeared through the sliding doors. He had completely forgotten about her. Giving her his most charming smile, he said, There you are, pretty girl. I thought I was going to have to run after you to get my phone back. She gave him a token look as she held out her phone to him. He took it and noticed that Cheryl had done exactly what he had asked her to do. And he needed a pleasant distraction from the grim events of the day, so he asked her, Are you busy right now? She shook her head. Taking his keys out of his pocket, he pressed the button to unlock his Beamer. It beeped and flashed its headlights. She was clearly impressed. Next chapter. Tracy walked into the house on tired legs and closed the door behind her. She sighed, mentally trying to shake off the worries of the day. You'd think she was just tired from work, but she was dealing with completely different issues. She stopped when her gaze fell on her husband, who was sitting on the couch. He was sitting with Anya. They were both hunched over. That wasn't remarkable in itself. What was remarkable was what they were both doing. He was reading Anya's book, Frozen, to her. She was finally letting him touch her most prized possession. He was now officially part of the family. He was a daddy. Tracy felt like crying. Why couldn't she savor this moment? Why did she have to ruin it like this? Upon seeing her mother, Anya instantly flew off her father's lap. Her little feet raced across the floor towards her mother. When she saw Anya running towards her, she wiped away her tears of self-pity and smiled sincerely. She had that effect on people. An excited Tracy picked up her squealing daughter in her arms. Hi, she said. For a moment, she forgot about rude customers, pushy managers, judgmental coworkers, and of course, Manchester Childs. Her vacation was short-lived, however. Reality returned to her as her eyes met her husband's for a moment. For a few seconds, he stared at her and then looked away. Trying to engage him in conversation, Tracy asked hopefully, How did you get Anya away from the babysitter? I'm her father, he replied emphatically. I didn't have any interviews today and needed a break from resumes and job searching, so I came to pick her up so we could spend time together. At least he was talking to her. That was something. She'd almost forgotten the sound of his voice. As warmly as possible, she said, Thank you. You saved me a trip. He only hummed in response. And just like that, the Cold War was on. Really, Rick? Still? She asked with annoyance. The seconds became quiet and awkward as she stood there, giving him a chance to say something. Anything. I love you. I hate you. Eat shit. I can't live without you. I'm divorced from your cheating. Anything but that damned silence. But he didn't say anything, just like he hadn't said anything for the past month. He just sat stone-faced, staring at something extremely interesting on the far wall. You know what? Screw this! She spat angrily. On the contrary, she gently set Anya on the floor. The girl, in turn, ran back to the lap she'd abandoned so Daddy could finish reading the book. Tracy, eyes flashing, rushed toward her room. Her hand grasped the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. She just stopped, as if in indecision. Turning her head back towards the living room, she said, "By the way, Manny showed up at my work." Rick's eyes flashed with anger. She laughed incredulously. "Oh, now you want to look at me. Once I mention Manny, I'll finally be worthy of your attention." His eyes drooped again. He growled and shook his head. "I bet that was fun." "Did you enjoy spending time with your boyfriend?" he asked caustically. Tracy walked back into the living room. In a voice trembling with excitement, she said, "No, it wasn't fun, asshole. That was scary. He didn't come there to see me. He was asking about you." Now she really had his attention. He sat Anya down on the couch next to him and stood up. "What did he want?" he asked, for the first time really looking at her. She was scared. He could see it in her face. Whatever Manny had done or said, she was clearly shaken. Tracy rubbed the hand that Manny had grabbed her by. She thought she could still feel his fingers against her skin. "He wanted me to make you forgive him." "Why?" he asked with a sneer. Throwing her hands up in the air, she exclaimed, "I don't know, Rick, but he didn't say he was giving me a choice." Rick became even more alarmed and asked, "What do you mean?" Tracy put her arms around her shoulders and shook her head as if trying to get rid of the feeling he had left in her. "He wasn't asking me. He was telling me, almost ordering me to make you talk to him. She didn't know how to explain what he made her feel. Not that he cared. So she sighed, threw her hands up in the air and said, "You know what? Never mind." She tried to walk away, but just like with Manny, Rick grabbed her arm to stop her. But unlike Manny, Rick's grip was soft and gentle. So the difference between the two men couldn't have been more stark. "Did he threaten you?" he asked with genuine concern in his eyes. Tracy shook her head and wiped her nose. "Not in so many words, but—" Rick nodded. Manny didn't have to voice his threats. People just knew that "or else" was meant silently. Despite his anger and frustration with her, she was still his wife. His love for her made him protect her automatically. He would never hurt her or let anyone else. With a determined look, he grabbed her shoulders for the first time in ages and pulled her to him, hugging her reassuringly. Pressed against his hard chest, she closed her eyes and exhaled. Suddenly, all the emotions she was feeling came rushing out of her in hot tears. She stood huddled against her husband's chest and cried. "Don't cry, Mommy," said Anya, sliding off the couch and running up to her. As Daddy hugged Mommy, she wrapped her little arms around her leg. "Daddy and I are going to make you feel better." This only made her cry harder. The intense sobs made her body shake. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to hold herself together. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry," she repeated over and over between sobs. Rick didn't respond. He couldn't. Right now, he needed to shut himself off from all of this. His need to protect her didn't mean forgiving her betrayal. Perhaps the time for such a conversation had come. Perhaps it had already passed, but he needed to wait a little longer. He had more important things on his mind right now. Manchester goddamn Childs. Rick had made him a promise about Tracy and Anya. Everyone knew and admired Rick. He was a man of his word. He refused to be a man who didn't keep his promises, even if they were in the form of threats. Resting his chin on her forehead, he whispered, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. Manny won't bother you anymore." She immediately stopped crying and recoiled from him. She knew that tone of voice. She knew what it meant. "No! No!" she screamed, pushing him in the chest with her finger. "You won't do what I think you're going to do!" In a deadly even voice, he said, I'm just going to talk to Mr. Childs about the fact that he threatened my wife. And what are you going to tell him? His eyes were full of determination. In the same calm tone, he replied, enough to get my point across. How much or little I say is up to him. Oh shit. He was going to kill him. Tracy's first instinct was panic. She couldn't lose him, not again. If he went to prison again, especially for murder, 4 years would be a mere park pass compared to what he'd get. Praying she still had some influence left to calm his inner demon, she softened her voice and looked him in the eye. Rick, kid, I need you to stay away from Manny. He's not worth it. You're doing so well. You're trying to get a job, you're a great dad to Anya, and you're staying out of trouble. But Manny? Manny what? She paused, trying to find a way to articulate what she wanted to say. She didn't want to patronize him, but she also didn't want to anger him with wording that would make him look weak. Left with no choice but complete candor, she said, Manny is still a bad influence on you. Even if you hate him, he has the power to make you the worst version of yourself. He came to me for a reason. He knows what buttons to push to get you to do what he wants. He let go of her and turned away, a growl escaping his throat. He didn't like that she thought so highly of her lover. He's not smarter than me, if that's what you're implying. I'm not smarter, she said quickly. But you're out of your mind when it comes to him. He'll use it against you. They were interrupted by Martha's presence. She, too, had just returned from work. Sensing the temperature in the room, she turned to her granddaughter. Anya, baby, let's go to the store for ice cream. And are there any other words more musical to the ears of a 5-year-old? As Martha put on her coat, Tracy looked her mother in the eye. An unspoken message of gratitude passed between them. Aloud, Martha said, It seems the store on the next street over is out of ice cream, so I'll have to drive across town. We might be delayed. Without waiting for an answer, she took her granddaughter's hand and led her out the door. For the first time in forever, Rick and Tracy were alone. Rick, please promise me that... You seduced Manny? He suddenly interrupted. That was it. Tracy felt as if she'd been whiplashed by the surprise, and she was stunned into silence. What? Rick didn't want to talk about it now, but he couldn't put it off any longer. The questions that had been burning inside him began to come out like vomit. He took a step closer to her. It wasn't threatening or intimidating, just purposeful. As he moved closer, she saw the irreparable pain in his twinkling eyes. The pain was so deep that she almost lost herself in it. When you went to Manny's house that first night, did you intend to get busy? It was a turning point. Tracy felt the weight of that question as if it pressed against her skin. She knew her husband. She knew how important trust and loyalty were to him. She'd failed at the latter. Lying to him now would only cause her to lose the former. After that, there would be no going back for them. She couldn't look into his eyes anymore. There was so much pain in them. And she knew that telling him now would only make it worse. But she promised herself that if he spoke to her again, she wouldn't betray his trust again. Lowering her eyes, she nodded and replied, Yes. After a moment's pause to recover from the punch to her stomach, he asked, Did you like it? Another nod. Yes. Anger flared in his nostrils. Of course, he knew the answers to these questions before he even asked them. He'd spent all his free time analyzing and overanalyzing that conversation with Manny. And yet he was somehow unprepared to hear that 3-letter word. It started coming out of him all at once. There were too many emotions to digest. He did the only thing he could at that moment. He pointed them at her and fired. How could you be infatuated with a man like him? I mean, he's evil. But you found him attractive enough. Why? How? Tracy tried to answer quickly enough. Her brain wasn't keeping up with her. Baby, is it about the money? He threw out before she could finish her thoughts. The more he spoke, the more misery poured out of his words. Is that what you see in him? Because that's what the other dumbass bitches see in him. They see cars, clothes, jewelry, and they don't care about the rest. But you're not like that. Please tell me you're not one of them. No, it's not like that at all. Then what was it? I have to know. I have to make sense of it. If not, it will drive me crazy. Because I was mad at you! She finally shouted out in an uncontrollable outburst. Suddenly, her beautiful almond-shaped face changed. Creases appeared on her forehead, her eyes narrowed. Pain mingled with anger. In a voice harsh and strong but not shouting, she said, "How could you leave me like that? You left me, Rick. You abandoned me for 6 years after you promised you'd always be there for me." I had no choice. Yes, you did, she shouted, jabbing a finger at his chest. Surprised by her outburst, he took a defensive step back. But she wouldn't let him do so. The space between them that he had created immediately closed. Gripped by rage and pain, she declared, "You can't play the victim by abandoning me. Don't you dare. You weren't kidnapped, Rick. You were arrested. You were handcuffed, thrown into a police car, and taken away for the crimes you committed. You were convicted in court for the crimes you committed. You were sentenced to 6 years for the crimes you committed. So don't stand there and tell me you had no choice." This time, Rick's mouth didn't work, and not willingly. He fell silent at the realization that he had no justification for her words. His silence only encouraged her. She was just getting started. Nah. Do you know what it's like to watch them take everything from me? The house, the cars, the clothes, you? I was left with nothing and no one. But I'm still left with you, because my world ends where you begin. After all this, after all that shit. You had a second chance to come back to Anya and me. All you had to do was tell them the truth about Manny. I could live without money and a house, but not without you. I needed you. So what did you do? She threw her hands up in the air and shook her head. You decided to leave us unprotected, knowing how long they tried to take you away from us so you could protect him. A weight of suppressed pain came over her. She'd held it in for so long, crushed it inside her. She wanted to be strong for Rick because she knew it was hard for him to be locked up. She didn't want him to know how much he had humiliated her, how much he had hurt her. But those feelings wouldn't go away, no matter how much she ignored them. Ironically, if she didn't talk about them, they grew stronger. She crossed her arms over her chest and hugged herself. Tears moistened her face. All she could do was look away and try to pull herself together. Rick wanted to object. He wanted to say something at least. But even with all the unreasonable anger building up in his stomach, he couldn't help but admit she was right. And if he'd made a different choice, things would have turned out differently. He wouldn't have left, and the two of them would have led normal, boring lives. His wife, however, was overlooking one small detail. Her choice. "You chose me, Tracy," he said, looking directly at her. There was no malice or anger in his voice. He said with honest determination, "I never, not once, lied to you. I told you exactly who I was. The expensive gifts I bought for you, you knew where the money came from. All the times I left you in the middle of the night and came back with bloody clothes to burn. You never once asked me about it because you knew. You were with me of your own free will, knowing what you knew. Just as I chose to do what I went to jail for, you chose to be with a man who could have gone to jail. So no, you can't play the victim either." Tracy looked like she was preparing to retort, but her mouth slammed shut. Deja vu flashed through her mind, because that was exactly what her mother had said over and over again. It was only now that she felt her mother was actually speaking. None of them were victims, at least not guiltlessly. Their fates depended on each other's choices, but it always started with their own. Battle fatigue came over them both. Seconds passed, and a contemplative silence fell between them. Both were lost in the mazes of their own thoughts. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, as if she were looking through him. He, in turn, was staring at the floor in front of him. The silence was broken by Tracy. Sighing, she said, "You know what, Rick? You're right. I've blamed you for my humiliation for a long time, but the truth is, it was my own choices that led me to this. I chose to stand by you no matter what anyone said in the courtroom. I chose that, and I'm going to have to live with it. But you know what?" She looked him straight in the eyes. There was a fiery determination in them, like she owned her world. Rick's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt anger overwhelm him. She's going to leave me. I've taken her too far. The moment he felt the cold blade of the famous sword, her eyes softened. She reached out her hand, taking it gently. "I would choose you again. I will always choose you because I don't know how to be without you. Manny can't change that. My mother, being broke, or even you can't change that. No matter how many times I have to choose you, I will always choose you, even when you don't choose me." She stood with a sad expression on her face. Looking at him, she finished, "But I hope you will choose me." With those words, she left the room. Next chapter. Rick sat in the chair for what seemed like hours. Thoughts and feelings fought for dominance within him. Tracy's words hit him with the force of a cyclone. "Pick me." She'd been right about that. He hadn't chosen her. He chose his street honor over her. He chose his reputation. He didn't want to be known as a snitch, no matter what it cost him. It cost him his wife and kid. Manny may have been like a brother to him, but his real family was the woman in the courtroom who cried as the police took him away. The pain in her eyes was incomparable to anything else. Rick considered himself indebted to the man who kept the money in his accounts, but really, he was indebted to the woman who begged his mom to give her a car so she could drive 3 hours to see her husband. Money is easy, especially for someone like Manny. Love and time are irreplaceable. That's what Tracy had given him. That's what she had chosen to give him. Part of Rick felt like he should forgive her, and the other part was telling him that he had every reason to never speak to her cheating ass again. He had so many questions and so much pain in answering them. His head was full of images he wished he could forget if he could. Without forgetting, he would never be able to forgive her. But this wasn't about forgiveness, at least not yet. It was about choices. Rick rose from his chair and headed toward Tracy's room. He almost thought he'd find the door locked, but that wasn't the case. The knob turned easily, as if it had been waiting for him. He swung the door open and saw Tracy lying in bed facing him. She was curled up in a ball. Rick heard sniffling. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The mattress groaned, sagging under his weight. Aware of his presence, Tracy still remained curled up. He placed his hand on her thigh. Her hand ended up next to his and lay on top of his. But she still remained in place. Sighing, Rick said, "I have so many questions, Trace. I wish I could just forgive you. I know I should. But there are a lot of things bothering me." She didn't acknowledge it, at least not directly. In a voice devoid of energy, Tracy said, "I'm tired, Rick. I'm just really tired." He knew she wasn't talking about going to bed. He nodded his head sadly. He was very tired, too. Her hand clenched tightly around his arm. At the same time, he felt her pull him with her. Knowing what she wanted, he gave in, lay down behind her, and pressed his whole body against her. She wrapped her arm tightly around his waist. He had to admit it felt good. It felt right. After a moment, he finally broke the silence and said, "I choose you, Tracy, but I'm not sure I have the strength to forgive you. At least not yet." She brought his hand to her lips and kissed the back of it. Then, in a husky voice, almost a whisper, she said, "It's a start. I agree." There were so many questions swirling in his mind, so many concerns. But like she said, he was tired. They would return to this conversation later. Then he would ask the hard questions. But right now, he just needed to hold her. Next chapter. Rick felt a tap on his shoulder. He woke up abruptly and turned to see his mother-in-law looking at him. Sleeping next to him in his arms was Tracy. Until that moment, he hadn't even realized he'd dozed off. Wow, he was really tired. "Hi, Martha. How are you?" he asked in a half-asleep voice. Martha had to hide a satisfied smile as she looked at the two of them. Nothing in her house was broken or damaged, so she could only guess that their conversation had gone quite normally. But that wasn't what she cared about right now. Something strange was going on, and it involved her son-in-law. "Some woman in my living room is asking for you." Confused, he replied, "Huh? Who?" "I think you need to go outside and talk to her yourself." Rick got up and went into the living room. Sitting on the couch was a woman he knew well, a woman he had known years ago. "Cynthia?" When she saw Rick, she jumped up from the couch, ran over to him, and hugged him. There were tears in her eyes. "Rick," she said in a shaky voice, "please, we need to talk." Part 2. What the hell is this? Thought Manny, awakening from a pleasant slumber. Who is this woman? It wasn't his girlfriend, Lisa. A vague memory of yesterday came over him. He remembered the batting cage, the trip to Walmart to talk to Tracy about convincing Rick to take the goddamn program. What was her name? Yeah, Cheryl. What a thing to find at Walmart. After returning Cheryl to his penthouse suite, he began mixing drinks at his bar. His mixed drinks had the desired effect. Cheryl relaxed, as did her inhibitions. Unfortunately, as the drinks flowed, his memory became increasingly hazy. Lifting the blanket, he peeked underneath to confirm his friend's identity. Scraps of memories surfaced in his mind. He definitely had fun last night. There was an insistent noise in his ear, the same one that had once awakened him from sleep. By now, he was awake enough to realize it was a cell phone. He reached over to the nightstand and picked up that pesky cell phone to see what dead person was calling him at 2:48 in the morning. He half expected it to be Lisa wondering where he'd been missing and why he wasn't returning her calls. He hasn't seen or spoken to her since yesterday. Picking up the phone, he was surprised to find that it wasn't Lisa calling him. However, it was another woman he was looking forward to seeing. In a lazy but cheerful voice, still hoarse from sleep, he said, "Hi, Trace. Didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Tell me you have some good news. Maybe it's time for Rick and I to make up." There was silence on the line for a few seconds, so much so that Manny thought she had dialed it. Then a deep voice, not Tracy's, said, "Yes, it's time. I'll meet you at your warehouse. Come alone. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Click. A beep. Oh shit. Derek! Manny's heart began to race. Droplets of sweat beaded on his forehead. Was he nervous? Why would he be nervous? After all, this was exactly what he wanted, to provoke him into a meeting. It seemed his little visit to his former lover had been a success. And yet it was freaking Derek. He was unpredictable. Which Derek would show up? Would he see the wolf or the sad puppy he'd been pretending to be all along? Manny already knew the answer. After all, he'd indirectly threatened the man's wife. Making up was the last thing on the agenda. However, the fact that Rick had shown up at all was good news. Rick he could handle. No problem. There wasn't a man in the world who didn't walk on water that could instill fear in Manny's heart. But just in case. Picking up the phone again, he dialed another number. When the guy picked up, Manny said, "Yo, Mo, guess who just called me?" "What time is it?" Mo yawned sleepily in his ear. "It's showtime. I just got a call from Rick. He wants to meet at the warehouse. I need you to get up and drive there." Then, after thinking for a moment, he added, "And take Tuck with you." A hesitant pause hung on the line before Mo moaned and said, "Manny, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning." So? So, after I took Donnie to the butcher and took care of his evidence car, I had to go back and help Tuck clean out the warehouse. We didn't finish until late afternoon. "What's your point?" Lowering his voice, he said, Come on, man. Me and my girlfriend just spent the night, you know? Manny sat up on the bed and, looking straight ahead, asked threateningly, Mo, what does all this shit have to do with what I just asked you to do? Drop the case and get your ass over there. A groan sounded on the other end, after which he said, Okay, I'll be there in about 45 minutes. 30. We both know it won't take you that long. At that, Manny ended the conversation and tossed the phone on the bed. Irrational irritation swept over him, leaving a foul taste in his mouth. Damn henchman. Maybe it was time to weed out the entire staff and start over. What happened to the days when people just did what they were supposed to do and didn't whine about it? These people seem to have forgotten who he is. First, Donnie had the nerve to steal from him, maybe, and now his minions feel comfortable enough to question him when he gives orders? The Colombians would be so disappointed to see this. When Manny pulled up in front of the house, Mo and Tucker were already waiting for him. Their shared headlights illuminated the dark space in front of them. Manny looked around, trying to find any sign of Rick, but saw only his team. And he turned off the engine and carefully got out of the car. Following his example, Mo and Tuck got out of the car as well. The trio of men met in front of their cars, turning their heads to survey their surroundings. Do you see him? Asked Manny, trying not to give away the nervousness in his voice. No. Are you sure he said he'd be here? Oh, he's here. Manny grinned to hide the feeling of anxiety creeping up his spine. Then, in a cocky voice, loud enough to cause an echo, he shouted, Are you here, Ricky? Silence ensued. Only the crickets answered him. Manny dropped his hand to his waist and strained his ears, hoping to hear an answer. He didn't know what game Rick was up to, but it would be a shame to make Tracy a widow tonight. The silence was interrupted when a voice came from behind them. Yeah, I'm here. Turning around, they saw Rick step out of the shadows and walk calmly toward them. Manny cast Rick a glance around, looking for signs of some sort of deception. In a half-joking manner, he asked, What the hell is this? You're Batman now? Ignoring Manny's attempt at a joke, Rick said, I see you didn't come alone like I asked. Apparently you needed some emotional support from the cheerleader. Then, tilting his head and smirking, he asked, Are you afraid of me, Manny? Manny pretended not to notice the look Mo threw at him. Instead, he chuckled carelessly, as if his heart wasn't like a horse's feet hitting the ground at full gallop. His hand gripped the pistol on his belt even tighter. Don't flatter yourself. That unafraid demeanor worked on everyone else, but not on Rick. He noticed Manny's hand, the slight tremor in his voice, and the way he adjusted to Rick's movements to ensure a controlled distance between them. Rick was making him nervous, and both guys knew it. Good. Right. Rick hummed unconvincingly, walking past them towards the warehouse. Turning his back to them, he asked caustically, And they were with you when all your shit got stolen? That stopped all three men. They looked at each other with questions in their eyes, and then looked at Rick. How did he know about this? Manny's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Within seconds, his hand was no longer on his belt. Nor was the gun. It was snatched from its hiding place and displayed directly in front of him. The barrel was aimed right at the back of Rick's head, and his finger was clenched. Before Manny could begin his interrogation, Rick calmly turned to face the nozzle as if he expected to see it. No, I didn't steal your product. He answered the unspoken question with a tinge of impassioned irritation. He said it as if it was stupid to even think about it. Manny studied him for a moment, but the only thing he saw was a nonchalant poker face. As if waving him and the gun away, Rick turned back toward the warehouse. He stood at the door, utterly bored, waiting for one of them to open it. How do you know about this? Asked Manny, still not lowering his scope. He looked at Mo, however, and with a nod of his head, he pointed at the door for him to open it. If he was going to stuff Rick's lying ass with some hot shit, he'd prefer it be inside, where he could control the sound of gunfire. The door opened, and the trio stepped inside before Manny locked them in. Only now he relaxed a little, though his gun was still pointed at the target. Rick was in his house. This was his world. Here he was a god. He decided who lived and who died. For Rick, entering the warehouse was akin to going back in time. It had been years since he'd seen it. He felt as if he had entered the school during a high school reunion. A flurry of old memories mingled with what had been added since he'd last seen him. Rick looked around nostalgically. Manny cleared his throat impatiently to bring him out of his reverie. "Answer my question, bro," he ordered, his fingers dancing over the trigger. Rick finally looked up at him, chuckled lightheartedly, and said, "Everybody knows you got mugged, dumbass. You can't keep something like that quiet. The streets are talking." Then, with a knowing grin, he asked, "Do the Colombians know about it yet?" Manny didn't answer, but he didn't need to. It was a rhetorical question anyway. The two of them knew how it all worked. The Sanchez family had so many eyes and ears on the streets that they could be considered omnipotent. Time, at least in Manny's case, was borrowed from an evil loan shark. The desperation in Manny's demeanor was obvious, even underneath all the bravado. Rick cast a glance at his poor minions. They stood, trying to look cool and intimidating. He remembered Took and Mo. Before he'd been locked up, they'd been a couple of small-time thugs robbing 7-Eleven and liquor stores. How they'd gotten into Manny's personal squad remained a mystery. It wasn't that hard to find out, though. They were big, scary-looking, but most importantly, dumb as hell. They were so dumb that they didn't even have the brains to be scared that they were totally screwed. When the Sanchezes come for the king, they usually clear the entire chessboard. Queens, knights, pawns, everything. If these two henchmen knew what hellfire awaited them, they would have had the same worried look in their eyes as Manny. Rick asked carelessly, "Where's Donnie?" Both henchmen looked at Manny with an awe expression. Rick looked around the room and cast a curious glance that turned to disbelief when his question was practically answered on its own. "Holy shit, you're kidding me!" he exclaimed. "Tell me you haven't done something as stupid and dirty as killing your own cousin." The guilty silence made him pinch the bridge of his nose sharply and sigh. Of course he'd killed Donnie. As Lieutenant Manny, he'd be the logical scapegoat, and we all know that scapegoats are the first to be sacrificed for the greater good. At least say you're absolutely sure he's the one who robbed you. Say he gave you valuable information about where you can find your goods. And for God's sake, tell me you didn't do the whole batting cage thing. Unblinking, wide-open eyes again. For God's sake! "How do you idiots manage to survive without me?" he asked rhetorically, amused by his own question. Manny needed to shut Rick up. The sportswoman and Scarecrow looked like they were ready to sing like a teenage pop group, and these know-it-alls were on a roll. For a guy who had no interest in returning to the game, he definitely had a lot of intimate knowledge. Narrowing his eyes, Manny said, "Unbutton your shirt." That only made Rick chuckle. "What? You think I'm wearing a wire?" By this time, Mo and Tuck were beginning to realize what was going on. Looking at them with heavy, wary eyes, they too drew their guns and pointed them in Rick's direction. Without the slightest hint of a smile, Manny repeated, "Open up." The tension in the room was building. It was only getting worse with each passing second. One movement of a finger, a cough, or even a sneeze could cause the direction of the night to take a deadly turn. Rick cast the three of them an aggrieved look for a moment. "I'm not a snitch. You of all people know that." Manny's only movement was a small smirk and an unconvincing hum. His aim remained true, as did the aims of his minions. Rather than let it annoy him, he decided to have a little fun with them. He took off his shirt comically, as if on a club scene. He helicoptered it over his head and threw it to the ground. But even the humor didn't help ease the tension. Manny remained utterly serious. There was pure venom on his face now. If need be, he was ready to end his second life in 2 days. With a nod of his head, he ordered his minions, "Pet him." They holstered their weapons and cautiously approached Rick. He didn't even resist. He just spread his arms and stood looking at Manny while they searched him. When they were done, Tucker said, "He's clean." Shaking his head, Rick asked Riley, "Does that turn you on? Are you sure you don't want to get the full brunt of this?" Finally, Manny lowered the gun. However, his paranoia wasn't ready to put it away. He just held it in his hand. Out loud, however, he asked, "So did you come all this way to see the old hangout spot? Or do you really need something?" Rick snorted angrily. With an angry look on his face, he admitted, "Actually, I wanted to punch you for that little stunt you pulled with my wife yesterday. But you didn't come alone like I asked, so—" Finally, Manny smiled and chuckled. It was the first thing from Rick that he actually believed. "Well, don't let Tuck and Mo stop you," he said invitingly. "And they're not stopping me," said Rick, oblivious to their presence. "In fact, it was Tracy who talked me out of it. She doesn't want me to go back to jail because of you. Although I doubt there's a single cop who wouldn't pat me on the back for getting rid of you." Manny couldn't help but feel a rush of nostalgia. Frankly, he missed the man. Rick's arrogance in thinking that three men with guns couldn't stop him from doing what he wanted was so comical that it was impressive. Manny put the gun away with an amused expression on his face. At that, he said, "You'd be surprised. Half of them either work for me or are regulars." Rick could only shake his head in disgust. "Are there any good cops?" "I'm sure there are, but he's probably sitting in Narnia somewhere, riding a unicorn and chasing a leprechaun." They both laughed, for the first time since it became clear that Tracy was a disgusting case. For a moment, Rick almost forgot that he hated the man. In that brief exchange, the friend he remembered appeared. Manny was like music. His fun, charismatic, and laid-back personality could get stuck in your head, even if you didn't intend it to. You could hate him to the core and yet hum his tune for hours. Rick's frown at Manny softened. Quite sincerely and openly, Rick said, "I need to cut you out of my life forever." "What do you mean?" "In the sense that you've been my best friend, Manny. Honestly, I don't think anyone other than Tracy will ever be as close to me as you are." Manny nodded in agreement. He felt the same way. "But—" With a sigh of regret, Rick continued, "You don't realize how toxic you are to those around you. Look how you treat the guys who let you close. You entertained my wife when I was locked up. You threatened her to get her to do what you wanted. You even destroyed Donnie. Truth be told, bro, you're not a very nice man." Few things could pierce Manny's Teflon skin. He didn't give a damn about his feelings or the feelings of others. Emotions were annoying little annoyances that made men weak and weakness the enemy. From Rick, however, that shit sounded hurtful. More than it should have. Manny's mouth curved again in an evil grin. Turning to the other two in the room, Manny said, "Watch this, boys. We're in for some entertainment tonight. Pastor Derek Morrison is here to teach us how to be better people." The other two chuckled. Picking up on the joke, Mo asked, "Boss, isn't this the guy who held Tommy up on the bridge to get information on the new team that was settling into your territory?" "Yep, that's the one." Tucker, not relenting, also asked, "Didn't he put Vinny in the hospital for 2 weeks? I saw him limping the other day. He hasn't been the same since." Nodding his head and grinning, he said, "Damn, Mo. You're right. He used to do that too." Everyone but Manny noticed that he was still confusing his minions. This time, they just let it pass their ears. There was no point in correcting him. Turning to Rick, Manny grinned and said, "Come to think of it, Pastor, I don't think you're the one who should be giving us these lessons. You don't seem to be a very nice person either." Rick laughed lightly and nodded his head. He'd known Manny long enough to not let crap like this hit him hard. In a calm voice, he said, "I never said I was innocent. I never even said I was a good guy. But at least the people who love me get love back." "Yeah, and look what it got you." The fire returned to Rick's eyes, filling them with anger. Manny, of all people, shouldn't have had the damn nerve to say such a thing. "Tell me what has to happen for you to be out of my life forever," said Rick, no longer hiding his calm. "There, now we're talking," thought Manny, closing the space between them. A calm and collected Rick made him nervous. Angry Rick, on the other hand, he was the one to deal with. In his cold, accommodating voice, he said, "It's simple. You're going to help me find the men who did this to me, make them suffer, and get the money I owe the Colombians. If you can do that, I will leave you. Besides, I'll give you enough money to start over. No more dead-end jobs, no more living with your mother-in-law. You and Tracy will be able to live like you used to." "All I'll have to do is sell my soul," said Rick, more to himself than to anyone else. "Sell my soul? What, am I the devil now?" Manny laughed and threw his head back. "When did you manage to become such a soft-hearted bitch? Did prison do this to you or Tracy? It's not worth—" It was all he could manage to utter. The anger in Rick's eyes was instantaneous. He moved so fast that Manny didn't even have time to reach for his gun. Before he knew it, Rick had grabbed him by his shirt and pinned him with his back against the wall. When Manny came to his senses, he was able to snatch the gun. Unfortunately for him, Rick was ready for him. Using his strength, he grabbed Manny's wrist and slammed his hand against the wall behind him. Flaring his nostrils, he growled, "If you mention my wife one more time, you'll be sorry. Do you hear me?" A sudden pain exploded in the back of Rick's head, forcing him to let go of Manny, and he collapsed to the ground. Stunned, before he knew it, the thugs were pouncing on him. "You should go home, Pastor Rick. This is a grown man's business. You're not a wolf. You're just—" Pride. It often ruins a person. Sometimes people make egregious mistakes when seemingly everything is in their hands. Before he could finish that thought, Rick reached out and grabbed him by his shirt. Then he drew back to punch him. Mo practically folded into himself. It was more than enough to incapacitate him. Rick blocked his path. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small photograph. It was wrinkled and tattered, as if the years had aged it badly. It was a picture of Anya, the same one he'd gotten when he'd been sent to prison. Every time he found himself in a situation where he thought he was going to lose control of himself, that picture brought him back. It was so beautiful, so pure. She needed a daddy. As if muttering to himself, he repeated, "I'm in control! I'm in control!" His breathing became more even, and the temperature of his rage gradually decreased. He closed his eyes and let the remnants of the rage fade away. He continued to ignore Manny, who was still standing in the background, transfixed by the fans' praise. And then, you hit him with an uppercut like, "Get over here." Rick finally opened his eyes, looked at Manny, and coldly inquired, "Will you ever shut up?" Manny stopped triumphant, and irritation flashed across his face. Pulling himself together, Rick shook his head and calmly walked around. "Has it gotten to you yet that all this is happening to you because you're such an asshole? You treat everyone around you like shit. Yes, fear and intimidation can work for a while. But what happens when it's over? Whoever did this to you wasn't afraid of you. Now you're asking for help from another guy you can't intimidate. And since you screwed up and, entertained his wife, now you have to bribe him with half of what he'll help you get back." Manny's hot head almost left him. He prepared to say something snide, but stopped himself. There was a subtle change in Rick's voice. Yes, he was being a total jerk, but there was more to it than that. "Is this a negotiation?" Rick only half smiled, but said nothing. Manny nodded as if to say, "Okay." Looking like he was deep in thought, he said, "Well, I was thinking more like 25%. Rick pretended to ponder that, then said, 75%. 75. What the hell? You can't go up." Shrugging, Rick replied, "And you can't entertain my wife. Guess we're both breaking all the rules, huh, Manchester?" Growling irritably, Manny said, "Fine. After I pay the Colombians what I owe, we'll split what's left 50-50. Damn, I knew this was going to cost me." Seeing the embers of rage flaring in Rick's eyes, Manny raised his hands in surrender and grinned. "Guilty. My bad. He said it, not wanting to break the tentative truce that had just been made. When Rick had calmed down, Manny nodded his head toward his unconscious staff and said, "You'll be the one explaining to Beavis and Butthead why they're not getting paid." Rick looked at the sleeping men with complete indifference and grinned. "I'm sure I can convince them." As Rick strutted around the warehouse again, Manny watched him with a Cheshire cat grin. He didn't like sentimentality, but it was nice to have his friend back. Sure, at the moment Rick hated him to the core, but things could change. Putting a lot of money in a man's hands could smooth over past grudges. "How much merchandise was stolen from you?" asked Rick with businesslike curiosity. "About 75,000. Rick nodded again. "How much did it sell for?" "I could have gotten about 2.5 for it," he said, pleased with himself again. After counting in his mind, Rick shrugged nonchalantly and began to slowly saunter away again. He stopped when he saw a strange coloring on the floor. To the casual eye, it wasn't conspicuous, but to someone like Rick, it was practically a neon sign. Tapping his foot on the stain, he said, "I see you didn't remove the plastic, or is it someone else?" "None of your business." Glaring, Rick replied, "It is my business. I'm not going to go to jail for you again. You're dirty and flashy. You do stupid things like that." "This," he said, tapping his foot on the discolored stain. "That's blood. Once those CSI assholes shine a black flashlight on it, it turns into evidence. If I'm getting involved in this case, I need to know who it is so we can get ahead of it." Grunting in agreement, he said, "Okay, that's Donnie. But that stain shouldn't be there. I told those two bastards to clean it up." Shaking his head disappointedly, Rick said, "I think you need to change your hiring practices." "Yeah, I'll have HR look into it." Pinching himself on the bridge of his nose, Rick sighed and said, "At least tell me you got rid of the evidence yourself instead of entrusting it to one of those two." "Dude, screw you!" Spat out a panting Mo, finally waking up from his slumber. He got to his feet, albeit a little wobbly. Rising to his feet, he looked at Rick and said, "You got me. Boss, please let me off this bastard. Please!" Manny chuckled and looked him over from head to toe, almost like a referee trying to assess a boxer after a knockout. "Are you sure you want a second round, Rocky?" Mo's self-esteem visibly faded as his boss laughed at him like he was nothing. With anger boiling in his eyes, he practically begged, "Just give me the word, Manny." "Easy, little Tay," said Rick, dismissively waving him away. "Why don't you go upstairs and play while the adults talk?" "Bastard, Mo tried to lunge at Rick, who didn't even flinch. He was stopped by Manny, who stepped between them. Manny pushed him away with an annoyed expression on his face. "Damn, dude!" yelled Manny. "Sit your ass down, Mo. We're trying to talk business here. How about instead of begging for another ass whipping, you go wake up your little brother?" Looking like a grounded child, he pointed at Rick's smug grin and said, "This ain't over, bitch. We're going to finish this." "It's a date," said Rick, and kissed him. As Mo walked away to his partner, Rick looked at Manny with bored desperation and repeated, "Please tell me you got rid of the evidence yourself." With a guilty look, he shook his head. When Rick groaned, Manny felt the need to protect himself, and by extension, his boys. "You can relax," he said quickly. "The bat is at the bottom of the river in the trunk of Donnie's car. And Donnie. Butcher took care of it." Still looking unconvinced, Rick asked, "Is that what you know, or what he told you?" By this time, Mo had woken Tuck up. He had been listening the whole time and was getting more furious by the second. Intervening in the conversation, he said, "In case you haven't noticed, we're all doing fine without you. The boss drives a Beamer and I drive a Rover. He lives in a penthouse. What about me? I live in a condo. So does Tuck. And you live in your mommy's house and take the bus. Manny may think you're crap, but all I see is a wimp living off the reputation of what he used to do." That made Manny look at Rick curiously, as if to ask, "What are you going to do about it?" As dumb as Mo was, he made some valid points. Of course, the fact that he made those considerations after he'd been knocked the hell out was just as valid. Rick didn't say anything back, just smiled. Then, out of the blue, he said, "You know what, guys? I think I've had enough. I've got everything I need." "Maybe you're right, Mo. Maybe I should just go home, put my feet up, put on some music, and eat some asparagus." "Asparagus?" asked Manny with a chuckle. "Is that what they fed you in prison?" With a sly, "I know something you don't," smile, Rick replied, "No, not when I was there. Let me know if they change that." "What?" Leaning closer, Rick whispered quietly, "You should have gone full Monty." No sooner had confusion turned to understanding than a loud bang drew their attention to the door. Shocked, horror-filled eyes stared helplessly at the swarm of SWAT teams rushing inside. The only one not surprised was Rick. "Everybody on the floor now!" shouted the patrolman. As Mo and Tuck carried out the order, he and Manny locked gazes. Rick watched the hurt look in his loyal friend's eyes turn to seething rage. Then Manny looked to the floor, to where his gun lay. Knowing Manny, Rick realized what was going to happen next before everyone else in the room did. "Blaze of glory? Not today. You're not getting off that easy." Before Manny could jump down and reach for it, Rick rushed past and tossed it aside. Having eliminated the possibility of suicide, the patrolman pounced on Manny, quickly pulling him to the ground. His arms were twisted behind his back and handcuffs snapped on his wrists. Out of the sea of guns came a plainclothes detective wearing a bulletproof vest over his shirt. As the resisting and swearing Manny was roughly lifted to his feet, the two men exchanged glances, after which the policeman smiled and said, "Manchester Childs, I am pleased to report that you, sir, are under arrest." With false bravado, Manny said caustically, "That's harassment, pig. Haven't we done this song and dance before? What do you think you have on me?" The grin of the cat that ate the canary appeared on the detective's face. "Well, let's see. First, you admit to getting $750,000 worth of drugs with the intention of selling them for $2.5 million. You know, because you're a wide-open guy? Besides, we have—" The detective's smile grew even wider as he looked at the spot where Rick's foot was tapping. Glancing back at Manny, he finished, "The murder of Donald Childs. And now, thanks to your big mouth, we know where to find the evidence." He looked at Rick, who nodded his head and added, "And if memory serves me correctly, I'm pretty sure you'll find the weapon in that room over there." "Rick, you're a goddamn snitch. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. I will destroy you. Do you hear me? Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Rick shook his head mockingly in Manny's direction. If ever there was a time to shut up, now would be the time. Manny, seized by irrational rage, lunged at Rick. Since his hands were tied behind his back, he lunged at him headfirst like a bull. The only thing he accomplished was to be pummeled to the ground again by the three guys. They weren't gentle either. He landed face down on the cold, hard, unforgiving floor. Mo and Tuck's handcuffs weren't nearly as dramatic. They had fully submitted to the cops, knowing that any resistance could end fatally. True to form, they managed to cast a furious glance at the snitch. Rick waved at Mo as he and his partner were led out the door. The detective gave Rick a look that was hard to decipher and held out his hand. "I didn't think I'd say this to you, Mr. Morrison, but good for you." Rick shrugged, accepting the handshake. "Yeah, but I never thought I'd be shaking hands with a cop. Life is full of surprises, detective." "It is." The detective nodded. "I have to admit, you had us worried for a second. We almost rushed in there ahead of time when things went south, but we heard you say you were in control, so we backed off and waited until we heard the safe word. Frankly, I was wondering how you were going to use the word asparagus to make it sound casual." Rick chuckled and nodded. "Yeah, but I'm not sure I succeeded. I hate asparagus." The detective threw another strange look at Rick, especially coming from a police officer. This time, Rick realized what it was in the detective's eyes. It was respect. You know, there are officers who have been on the force for years and can't stay calm like you. You had a gun pointed at you. You were being jumped on, and the guy was trying to use every soft spot he knew. Yes, you were a bit confused, but you still managed to get him and one of his men to fully acknowledge you. What you accomplished tonight is impressive. Nodding gratefully, he added, in another life, you would have made a great negotiator. Yes, in another life, far from this one. No offense, but I like cops about as much as I like asparagus. The detective gave him one last friendly pat on the arm before walking away. Over his shoulder, he shouted, there are still some good cops left, Mr. Morrison. We can't all transfer to Narnia. I'll have to take your word for it. Rick took a deep breath and looked around the warehouse one last time. If he never saw this place again, it would be too soon. With those words, Rick headed for the exit. He walked past the SWAT team, the forensics team, and the flashing lights of dozens of police cars that flashed across the sky. He found the car he was looking for, opened the passenger door, and got in. Officer Giuliani looked at him with a proud expression on his face. Then he patted him on the shoulder and asked, how you feeling, kid? For some reason, Rick thought he was going to feel like a winner. He had won. He had beaten Manny at his own game. But for some reason, he didn't feel good. He felt like a snitch. He answered that question honestly, leaning back against the headrest with a sad sigh. The policeman nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and put it back in the tray. Calming down, he said, whether you realize it or not, what you did here was incredible. I was surprised when you called me and told me you were willing to do the right thing about Manchester, but I wasn't shocked in the slightest. You are one of the rare people out of prison for the crimes you committed. You genuinely want to rehabilitate yourself and become a better person, even if it means giving up easy money. It's people like you that give me hope and keep me at this table. Thank you for that, kid. Looking up at him, Rick sighed uncertainly. He looked exhausted, as if his whole soul was tired. Throwing another glance at the chaos outside the window, he said, if it's all the same to you, Officer Giuliani, I'd like to go home. I need to see my wife. The policeman nodded understandingly. I understand. As soon as you get them to take the microphone off you, I'll get you home. Rick nodded gratefully, got out of the car, and went in search of the detective. Next chapter. When Rick reached home, sunlight was streaming into the living room through the blinds. He tried to slip quietly through the front door without waking anyone, but Cynthia barely had time to close her eyes. She was lying on the couch in a shallow sleep, and her eyes opened as soon as she heard movement. She didn't know what she expected to see. Her heart had yet to accept that her husband might be dead. Could he just be on the run and hiding from Manny? Donnie was so smart. He wouldn't go out with a psycho like Manchester, knowing he wanted to kill him, without a backup plan. But the look on Rick's face when he caught her gaze was not good. It was sympathetic. Did you find him? She asked with hope in her voice. Damn. Rick sighed as if searching for the right words, then explained. When I left here last night, I went to see my probation officer. He knows the cop who's investigating Manny. Cynthia gasped in horror. What the hell? You went to the cops? Yeah, I had to. She jumped up from the couch and screamed. I asked you to go and talk to Manny about Donnie, not the damn cops. Oh my God, this is bad. This is bad. If they search the house, Donnie's definitely gone. What are me and the kids gonna do if he goes to jail? Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Cynthia, exclaimed Rick, grabbing her by both shoulders to make her stop. When he got her attention, his voice lowered and he said, Donnie's dead. Huh? He didn't want to repeat it. As the words hung in the air, he saw realization begin to dawn on her face. Her lips moved, weakly trying to form words. Nothing but inarticulate sounds came out until she said quietly, almost in a whisper, "He can't be dead. I saw him only yesterday." She looked at him as if begging him to give up those two words. She would have heard anything but that. But he could neither do what she wanted nor say what she needed to hear. Instead, he said, "Manny confessed to destroying it." The grotesqueness of that sentence struck her to the core. Tears streamed down her face, turning into a mirror of pain and horror. "No, no, 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 no," she screamed as her shaking body began to collapse before his eyes. She collapsed under the weight of her new reality and began to fall to the floor. Fortunately, Rick saw that she was about to fall, so he quickly put his arms around her and led her over to the couch. "Oh my God!" She howled as the widow's song of heartbreak burst from her lips. She sobbed loudly into Rick's chest and beat him with her small fists. "He can't be dead! You're lying! Please don't lie!" It seemed to him that they weren't alone. Glancing toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, he saw his wife and mother-in-law standing there. There was a look of heartbreaking sympathy on each of their faces as the woman in Rick's arms bitterly mourned the end of her world. When he and his wife met their gazes, she got a good look at his face. The bruises left from the altercation with Mo and Tuck were now clearly visible. Her worry for the woman evaporated as she now had new worries. Rick? Can I talk to you in the kitchen, please?" Tracy asked with excessive politeness. He wanted to object to leaving Cynthia like this, but his wife's notes of icy politeness piqued his curiosity. So he told Cynthia that he would go into the next room but would be back shortly, and met Tracy at the dining room table. "How are you?" he asked with a note of impatience in his voice. "What's up?" she repeated, shrugging wryly. "You're telling me? You took my phone and left last night without saying anything to anyone, and now we find out you went to the police to turn Manny in. Not to mention you look like you've been in a fight. What exactly is going on here?" "It's a long story." "I'm listening." And Rick began to tell her the abridged version. Perhaps he should have softened some of the details, because he didn't get very far before he was interrupted. When he got to the sentence about meeting 3 guys in a warehouse wearing wire cleverly disguised as a belt buckle, Tracy freaked out. "Wait! What?" screamed Tracy. "You wore a damn wire to talk to Manny and his goons, and you went out there by yourself. With Manny? Are you crazy?" Rick was somewhat discouraged by her choleric response. Then he felt insulted by her hypocrisy. "Yes, with Manny. The same dangerous criminal you've been having an affair with for God knows how long." Indignation immediately appeared on her face, and she replied, "So that's why you did it. You risked your damn life to get back at me." "Petty revenge? Isn't that why you had fun with him in the first place?" Martha, who had quietly entered the kitchen and sat listening, could see that the conversation was spiraling out of control and losing meaning. With each exchange, they grew louder and louder, descending further and further down the rabbit hole of drama. No doubt their grief-stricken guest in the living room had already heard every word. "Will you both stop it?" she shouted sharply, causing the couple to instantly stop bickering and turn toward her. Stepping closer and lowering her voice, she said, "This poor woman just found out that her husband was beaten, and you two are sitting here arguing about it? This is not the time, place, or way to have this discussion. This is about her right now, not this soap opera you two are making. Do you understand me?" Like scolded siblings, they both lowered their heads. Almost in unison, they said, "Yes, ma'am." She sighed, as if enjoying the silence, and said, "Good." Then, turning her attention to her son-in-law, she continued, "That woman needs to go to the police. No doubt they'll be looking for her with a lot of questions. It would be best if she could get ahead of them and have someone by her side. I know you've had a rather, adventurous night, but we can't let her do this alone. So I think the two of us should go with her to the station." Nodding at her wisdom, Rick said, "I was just thinking the same thing." She stroked his unshaven cheek affectionately, as if rewarding him for being smart and agreeing with her. Then she gave him a cheerful look and said, "Before we do anything, I think you should do something very important first. It's probably the best thing you can do for anyone right now." "What's that?" "Take a shower." She said it with a twisted smile. It broke the tension in the room, and the three of them laughed. Rick left to rid them of his stench. Tracy tried to leave too, but her mom grabbed her arm. "You know he did that for you and Anya, right?" Tracy lowered her eyes and nodded. "I know. Manny coming to my work scared him a little. I could see it in his face when I told him." She grinned bitterly, then added, "That's what made him finally stop ignoring me." Martha smiled admiringly. "I don't think there's anything in this world that scares that man more than harming you two. He doesn't even fear for his own life. He risked it because Manny became a danger to you, and he'd gladly do it again." "But that's what scares me, Ma. He could have died tonight. I can't lose him again. I won't survive it." Tracy became so agitated that she broke into sobs. Martha pulled her daughter to her and hugged her tightly. She lovingly stroked Tracy's head and said in a comforting whisper, "It's time for you two to learn to communicate. You need to be able to tell him these things without anger or resentment. Then you can both do what you do best. Fight for each other until your last breath." Tracy nodded, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. A determination like she'd never felt before settled in her. This was exactly what she was going to do. She was going to fight for her family and her marriage. But first, she had to conquer herself. She had to finally let go of the simmering anger that was constantly bubbling up inside her. Every time she thought about life without Rick, she felt the knife of betrayal stabbing into her. Yes, she was the one who had cheated, but he had cheated first. He cheated with Manny when he decided to keep her longer than he should have. Did Rick's love for his family so overshadow his love for Manny that he would choose him? That's exactly what he'd done when it came down to it. He'd chosen Manny. So she had too. Rick was right about one thing. Her act had been petty. She could admit that. But that didn't even make her feel better. She loved a man who didn't love her with the same fierceness. But she'd told Rick yesterday that she'd always choose him in the end, even if he didn't choose her. And nothing about that sentence would change. Next chapter. Making the choice to do what he did was the hardest thing for him to do. It was like he was forcing himself to be something he wasn't. But when Manny showed up at Tracy's work yesterday, he had to make a decision about what was more important. In fact, he was once again faced with the same choice he'd made almost half a decade ago: street honor or family. For him, that choice had never been about Manny. Sure, Manny had been his best friend at the time, but Rick would have done what he did for any member of his team. When it came down to it, Rick didn't choose Manny over Tracy, he chose himself. Being a husband and father is a pale comparison to being a goddamn wolf. But yesterday, Manny had gone to Walmart not to help Tracy, but to send Rick a message. He wanted Rick to know that he could get to her if he wanted to, and even his past friendship with the two of them wouldn't stop him. She was a pawn to him because she was Rick's queen. When Manny really wanted something, he left a person with only two options: do what he said and sleep well at night, or don't. However, Rick had inadvertently made the blurred choice crystal clear. Now all that was left to ask was who would respond to Manny's not-so-subtle chess move: the husband or the wolf? The Rick of yesteryear would have acted like a thug in this situation. He would have grabbed a gun, shoved it in the mouth of one of Manny's little buddies, and made them mutter where to find him. He would then break into his house and wait for him to come home. Manny would find Rick sitting on the couch drinking his best wine with an evil grin on his face and a gun in his lap. It would have ended in a spectacular shootout with one of two outcomes. Both would have meant that this time he was out of the family for good. But the Derek who stood here now was no longer the same. This Derek would always choose Tracy and would never voluntarily leave her. That was the only honor worth swearing to. Next chapter. That afternoon, Rick and Martha traveled with Cynthia to the police station. By this time, Mo had already been questioned in detail about his taped statements regarding the butcher. The police managed to track down the store, arrest the people who worked there, and find Donnie's body. Or rather, parts of Donnie's body. He had been chopped up into several pieces, packed up, and was going to be taken to various places for disposal. That's how Manny disposed of his bodies. This was the target of Casey's Fine Meats, aka the butcher store. It was one of his many fronts. Cynthia recognized Donnie's head. She then vomited and lost consciousness. Killing and destroying Donnie weren't the only things Mo confessed to. As soon as he was seated in a dingy, monochromatic interrogation room with a two-way mirror, he began warming up his Whitney Houston vocal cords. And I will always love you. Turns out he and Tuck weren't as dumb as they'd been made out to be. They were the ones who stole Manny's merchandise. They were tired of working for him, tired of being constantly put down and feeling like they were next on deck in the batting cage. They did it in hopes that the Sanchez family would get rid of their problem and maybe see them as something more than a hired force. But what Mo regretted most was Donnie's death. He knew the blame would be placed on Donnie, and it was perfect for his plans. Everyone would look the other way, but no one would get hurt. After all, Donnie was Manny's cousin. He was the one person Manny wouldn't kill. Right? Now Donnie's ghost would haunt him forever. In the months that followed, Manchester Childs became one of the most infamous names in the news. The case had all the hallmarks of a blockbuster thriller, and it all ends with the villain being caught in an epic showdown with the police. There was no way such juicy news was going to die anytime soon. It seemed like every week a new sensational piece of information popped up. The police raided a butcher shop. Low-level drug dealers were arrested, leading to more confessions. By the time it was all over, Manny had become the youngest and most notorious gangster caught in recent history. He had a better chance of being abducted by aliens than living as a free man again. Unless, of course, he snitched on the Sanchezis. Rick, for one, was glad the cops kept their word and didn't mention him. He had no desire for fame and just wanted to keep his head down and not get involved in sensationalism. Besides, where he came from, being a snitch wasn't considered heroic. Even against someone as famous as Manny was, people still didn't approve of him. Naturally, there were whispers about his involvement, but no one said a word to his face. Corrected or not, he was still Rick. Plus, his reputation made most people discount it. He'd already done time for Manny. What would make him snitch on the investigation? It was probably a good thing Manny had kept quiet about entertaining Tracy. There weren't many people who would take that little bit with a smile. All Rick had to do was live his life, serve his parole, and become a normal citizen like everyone else. Yeah, that's right. Easier said than done. Rick may have helped take a criminal off the streets and gotten praise from the police, but the downside of not knowing about it was that in the eyes of the business world, he was still an ex-convict. Places that hired ex-convicts didn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They hired them because they were disposable. The pay was minimal, and nobody cared if they were treated fairly. He could be a free man, but the shackles of prison still gripped his wrists tightly. His past haunted him from job to job, employer to employer. Martha worked with Rick, trying to help him become less threatening in the workplace. The intimidation that helped him on the streets had the opposite effect at work. The two of them worked on softening his demeanor, speaking eloquently, and controlling his temper. He tried to incorporate all these lessons into his life, hoping that one day someone would see him as a person trying to be a better person. But we all know that life doesn't arrange itself so neatly. Like the stink of a skunk, nothing he did spared him from a criminal record. Imagine listening to your short, middle-aged, out-of-shape employer belittle you in front of everyone because it makes him feel good that he can push the big guy around? Or the hopeless feeling of being blamed every time something goes missing? How about accepting that the women in the office feel unsafe, even though he's done nothing to make them feel that way? It's been that way in all of his jobs. Pride is a tough pill to swallow, especially when you have to wash it down with crap sandwiches and stuff every day. But every time he found himself ready for the reincarnation of the wolf, He pulled a crumpled and battered picture of Anya out of his pocket to remind himself what he was fighting for. And then, finally, life smiled on him. Martha had started dating a nice man she had met. After being away from dating for so long, she was already rusty. But he was kind and patient with her. And while that was insignificant to Rick, to Martha, the fact that her new beau was a business owner made a big difference, especially if that business was a chain of hair salons. Don't forget that Manny ran multiple money laundering businesses. Which one was Rick in charge of? Oh yeah, the barbershop. Next chapter. 2 years later. Rick rang the buzzer of the familiar building in front of him. Wrapped in a thick coat, the harsh wind whipped across his face, which was the only exposed part of his body. "Can I help you?" said a familiar voice in an indifferent tone. "Derek Morrison," he replied. The buzzer jingled loudly, letting him know to quickly make his way inside. As he approached Linda's desk, he smiled broadly at her. Of course, she just looked at him with the same disinterest she'd been looking at him with for his entire probationary period. "You may pass," she said nonchalantly, and went back to her computer. "I bet she doesn't do anything on that computer except play solitaire," joked Rick to himself as he headed toward the office. Tapping lightly on the glass of the open door with his knuckle, he caught Officer Giuliani's attention before walking in and sitting down. "Mr. Morrison, good to see you today," he said, opening the manila folder that lay directly in front of him. Rick nodded his acknowledgement and then continued. "This is your last probationary visit. I, for one, couldn't be happier. You're a pain in my ass." "Well, it's a big ass. I think you can handle it," said Rick jokingly. "Besides, I think you'll miss me." "I'll miss you like a headache." "An adorable headache?" Throwing him a blank stare over his glasses, the policeman asked, "Is there such a thing as a charming headache?" At that, they both laughed. For Rick, this last visit was bittersweet. He was glad he was finally off probation, but he would definitely miss Officer Giuliani. That man, that cop, had had a profound impact on his life. He was definitely one of the good ones. It was nice to see that there were those left who didn't have to go to Narnia. The rest of the visit went pretty quickly. Rick didn't have to pee in a cup, nor did he have to talk about his job search. He liked working at the barbershop. He got along with his coworkers, he had regular customers, and he was making decent money. Now he and Tracy had their own apartment downtown and even a new car. Things were finally looking up for him. When Officer Giuliani escorted him outside for a cold weather smoke break, he said, "By the way, congratulations on the birth of your baby. I know I'm probably 7 months late. Do you know what you're having?" Glowing with pride, Rick replied, "Anya is having a baby brother. His name is Noah." "Noah?" repeated Officer Giuliani, and nodded, running it through his head. "I like it. Really biblical." "Yes, that's why I chose it. Noah was the man who survived the flood that wiped out everyone else. He chose his family and listened to the voice that told him to do the right thing over the world around him." Smiling proudly and shaking Rick's hand, Officer Giuliani said, "I'm glad he did that." When the two men parted for the last time, each was left with the realization of the profound impact the other had on their lives. There are people who come into your life for a season and people who stay for a lifetime. But even the most short-term relationships can have lasting effects. Next chapter. Rick brushed the snow from his feet onto the mat before turning the key and unlocking the front door. He didn't feel like listening to Tracy's words about smearing snow on the carpet. He smiled to himself as he repeated the thought. His front door, where he lived in his apartment with his family. It sounded nice. "Dad." That's what greeted him inside as the tiny imp rushed toward him. Picking her up in his arms, he tickled her belly. "You're getting too big for Daddy to pick you up. What does Mommy feed you?" "Hot dogs," she squeaked, trying to break free from his fingers. Tracy walked over to him, holding onto her bulging belly. Her swollen bare feet made almost no sound as they made their way across the carpet. She stood on her toes and kissed him, then looked disapprovingly at his shoes. I knocked all the snow off them, he defended himself, already realizing where this was going. She replied with a disgruntled look. They're still wet, Rick. That's why I'm telling you to take them off outside before you walk across my carpet. Okay. He gave up. Putting his daughter on the floor, he took off his shoes and carried them to the hall closet. Then he turned to his wife and with an exaggeratedly open hand motion as if to ask, satisfied? She only rolled her eyes irritably. Rick could only stare at his wife in amazement. How could a woman be so beautiful? Perhaps he was biased. After all, she was pregnant with his second child. But if he had to cast his vote for the most beautiful woman ever to be born, it wouldn't even be there. Dinner was served shortly afterward. The family sat down at the table, and Tracy looked at each of them. Everything was perfect. This moment was exactly what she wished for every night when Rick was locked up. She didn't need money and cars to be happy. Everything she could ever wish for was sitting right here at this table, stuffing spaghetti into their mouths. Despite this, gloomy thoughts filled her, crowding out the happy ones. She couldn't escape the feeling of remorse. This was something she had almost lost, something she deserved to lose. What would her life be like if Rick hadn't forgiven her? What if he'd just walked away? Or worse? She didn't even notice the tears flowing. It wasn't until Rick raised a concerned look at her that she realized how much misery was written all over her face. Trace? What happened? Trying to gather her thoughts, she tried to speak up, but the words wouldn't come. I just... What, baby? The sob that had been waiting to come out for so long came out. Rick rose from his seat and squatted down next to her. As he soothingly stroked her back, she was finally able to say, I'm just so happy. To that, he only smiled and stroked her arm. I am too. I know I was against marriage counseling at first, but I'm so glad your mom insisted on it. I'm starting to believe she's our guardian angel. Oh my God, said Tracy, bursting into tearful laughter. Please don't ever tell her that. She already thinks she knows everything. He gently kissed her salty, tear-soaked lips. I love you. I love you too, Rick. At the table, Anya must have felt left out. With spaghetti sauce coating her mouth, she threw her hands up in the air and asked, Who loves me? Both parents looked at each other playfully for a moment and then rushed over to her. She squealed and giggled with delight as each parent took her cheek and gave her a loud, boisterous kiss. Breaking news. The body of Manchester Childs, a notorious gangster who led an underground drug trafficking ring for nearly a decade, was found this morning. His trial lasted nearly 9 months until he suddenly changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. Insiders say he took the deal with the district attorney because he was willing to provide evidence against his supplier in exchange for a lighter sentence. No one has seen or heard from Mr. Childs for nearly a year. He was believed to be under police protection. Investigators have not said whether they suspect police involvement in his death. However, they did not rule out that possibility. Records show that Mr. Childs' empire brought in $3 million to $4 million a week. He left no next of kin behind. The investigation is ongoing. We will let you know when more information becomes available. The end. If you missed the first part of this video, you can find the link in the comments or in the description. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.